They kicked me out on my 16th birthday 19 years later. My mom emailed me asking to pay for her other kids' private school tuition. I remember this one summer day with eerie clarity, the kind of memory that feels too sharp around the edges to belong to childhood. I was maybe 5 or 6, sitting in the corner of our tiny living room in our duplex in the Philly suburbs, playing with my stuffed rabbit while my mom, Lori, was on the phone in the kitchen. I only caught pieces of her conversation through the clatter of dishes and the sound of her voice, trying way too hard to sound cheerful. The words double shift and again made their way through. I didn't know exactly what it meant at the time, but even then I understood that Mom was tired. Really tired. My dad had left a few months before, though no one said the word left. They said he moved out or was staying with a friend. I hadn't seen him in weeks. Then Jeff came into our lives. Jeff Richardson, the guy who always ordered the same patty melt and black coffee at the diner where Mom waitressed. At first, he was just some friendly man who tipped in crumpled bills and left notes for my mom that made her smile even when her back hurt too much to stand up straight. Eventually, his name started popping up more often, like a background character in our lives slowly stepping into frame. I don't remember the exact day he moved in. Just that one morning there were 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom and a coffee mug that said "Best Dad Ever" on the kitchen counter. Not "World's Best Stepdad," not "Boyfriend of the Year," "Best Dad Ever." That mug confused me. The first few weeks were quiet, like everyone was pretending not to notice that things had changed. Jeff wasn't mean. Not then, anyway, but there was something about how he moved through the house that made it feel less mine. Like we were guests in a place he owned, even though we hadn't moved. He rearranged the furniture, told me not to leave toys in the living room, insisted we stop using the small TV in the kitchen because dinner's for talking, not watching. My mom didn't argue. I tried to be polite. I was a quiet kid, always scared of making things worse. I started eating faster at the table, kept my voice low, stopped playing music in my room when he was home. But even then, I could feel the distance building, not just with Jeff, but with my mom too. She stopped sitting on the edge of my bed at night. When I had nightmares, it was Jeff who came to check, and he'd just stand there in the doorway with a sigh like I was wasting his time. He never yelled, not outright. It was more the way he looked at me, like I was a problem he hadn't agreed to solve. Eventually, I stopped asking to go out for ice cream or watch movies together. I'd hear them laughing in the living room while I stayed in my room with the door shut, learning how to be quiet in a house that didn't feel like mine anymore. It wasn't long before my last name started to feel like a detail that only I remembered. Everyone at school started calling me Cassie Richardson because that's what Jeff would write on school forms, and my mom never corrected him. The worst part was, I kept thinking it was my fault. I mean, Jeff always smiled around my mom. He helped with groceries, fixed the squeaky cabinet, picked her up from work when her car broke down. When he'd ruffle my hair or call me kiddo, she'd beam like we were some picture-perfect family. But those touches never felt right. They weren't affectionate. They were performative, like he was checking a box on a list of good stepdad tasks. I knew better than to complain. When I was 7, I asked Mom if we could go visit Nana again, the only place I ever felt like myself. Jeff had walked in right then, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He didn't say anything, just stared at my mom. She didn't answer my question. Instead, she asked if I'd finished my homework. I stopped asking after that. By the time I was 8, I'd learned to keep my backpack packed and my answers short. I started eating dinner at the corner of the table, only speaking when spoken to. Jeff wasn't abusive in the way people imagine. He never raised a hand. But there's a kind of hostility that lives in the silence between sentences, in the way a grown man sighs when you walk into a room, in the slow erosion of warmth from someone who used to be your entire world. That's what childhood started to feel like, an endless negotiation of space. Every room I entered felt borrowed. Every laugh I had to suppress felt like a betrayal of Jeff's comfort. My mom started working less because Jeff was helping out more financially, but the trade-off was that she started acting like we owed him something. Like I should be grateful. I wasn't. I was confused. And I was alone in that house more often than not. By the time I hit double digits, I had stopped calling her mom out loud. It wasn't conscious. It just started to feel wrong, like a word that didn't belong to me anymore. She barely noticed. I remember one night, maybe a year after Jeff moved in, I was brushing my teeth when I noticed my old drawings had been taken down from the fridge, replaced by a dry erase calendar and some coupon magnets. I stood there for a minute, toothbrush dangling from my mouth, just staring at the blank space where my crayon rainbow used to be. That's when I knew. I wasn't really a part of that house anymore. I just lived there, like a tenant, like a placeholder for a child they might have wanted. That's how it started. Quietly, with the slow, careful removal of all the things that made me feel like I belonged. I never got them back. The party was Jeff's idea, of course. A backyard barbecue with those tacky red and white checkered tablecloths, disposable plates that buckled under the weight of potato salad, and a cooler full of beer that he guarded like it was his personal treasure chest. My mom wore this loud, floral maxi dress she'd never owned before and kept calling it a fresh start. I remember watching her laugh at one of Jeff's dumb jokes, the kind where you had to be a few beers in to find it funny, and realizing I couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at me like that. Luke and Hannah were there too. Luke was 9, obsessed with Pokemon and already talking back like he owned the place. Hannah was 7, clingy in that way that made adults find her adorable and made other kids want to avoid her. Everyone kept saying how great it was that the kids were getting along, but I hadn't spoken more than 5 words to either of them, and most of those were just, "Can I get past you?" After that day, things changed fast. The rental house we'd had for years got sold, and we moved into Jeff's place, which was bigger, technically, but never felt bigger to me. Luke got the largest room after Jeff said boys need more space. Hannah got the one with the bay window because she's younger and still has nightmares. I was shoved into the smallest room at the end of the hall, the one with the sloped ceiling and a draft that whistled through the window every time the wind picked up. They said I'd like it because it was cozy. I had to duck to stand by the dresser. At first, I tried to make it feel like mine. I taped my favorite posters on the walls, the ones from movies my dad used to take me to before he disappeared from my life entirely. But every time Jeff passed by, he'd glance in and make some snide remark about the mess or the noise from my CD player, even if it was barely audible. So I stopped playing music. I started keeping my door shut, then locked, then just gave up entirely. It wasn't long before my friends stopped coming over. At first, my mom claimed we were just trying to give the new family space to adjust. Then it was, "The house is too full already," or "You can hang out at their place instead." The truth was, Jeff didn't like kids he hadn't personally approved of. One time, when my friend Lila dropped by unannounced with a math worksheet I'd left at her house, Jeff told her through the screen door that I wasn't home. I was upstairs, watching it happen from the window, the worksheet in her hand as she stood there blinking, confused. There was a shelf in the living room that used to have pictures of me and my mom from when it was just the two of us. Us at the zoo. Us eating snow cones at the shore. Us baking cookies in the apartment kitchen with flour on our noses. One day I came home from school, and they were gone. Replaced with a family photo from the barbecue and a few shots of Luke holding a soccer trophy. My mom said she just wanted everything to match now that we were all together. But all I saw was a forced symmetry that didn't include me. Meals became this weird ritual I dreaded. Jeff would hold court at the head of the table like he was some sitcom dad from the 80s, asking the same boring questions about school, while Luke complained about broccoli and Hannah picked the raisins out of her salad like they were poison. If I spoke up, Jeff would interrupt or correct me mid-sentence, and my mom would just smile tightly like I was making things difficult on purpose. Eventually, I stopped talking altogether. I'd eat in silence, clear my plate without a word, and go back to my tiny room before dessert even hit the table. There was this one night, one of the last times I remember trying. I stayed behind after dinner to help clean up, thinking maybe if I showed I still cared, my mom would notice. I was rinsing dishes when she came in, humming to herself like we were back in our old kitchen. I tried to talk to her, asked if she wanted to maybe do something together that weekend, just us. Her smile didn't drop, not exactly, but something in her eyes went distant. "Let's see what Jeff has planned," she said, like it wasn't even a question anymore. She was always checking with Jeff after that. For dinner plans, for schedules, even for which movies we could rent from the Redbox. Jeff didn't like anything too moody or too weird. So there went the films my mom and I used to watch under a blanket on rainy days. There went the last piece of her I thought I still had. By the time the holidays rolled around, I didn't even pretend anymore. I helped decorate the tree out of obligation, even though all the ornaments were Jeff's, Luke's, or Hannah's. Mine stayed in a plastic bin in the basement, apparently too fragile to hang this year. On Christmas morning, Jeff handed out the presents. I got a scarf I never wore, still with the price tag on it, while Luke unwrapped a game console, and Hannah got a full set of art supplies that took up half the kitchen table. My mom didn't even look at me when I said thank you. After a while, she didn't really look at me at all. She was busy, always busy, with the kids, with Jeff, with volunteering at Luke's school, or helping Hannah with dance class. She stopped asking me about mine. I don't remember the last time she asked about my grades. When I got a B+ on a science project I spent 2 weeks on, I told her in the car on the way home. She nodded and said, "That's great, sweetheart," but didn't even look up from her phone. I started walking home alone after that, even when it rained, even when it snowed. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, that narrow little cot that creaked when I rolled over, and listen to them downstairs laughing over a movie I hadn't been invited to watch. I memorized the pattern of the plaster in my ceiling, counted the cracks, named them just to keep from crying. Some nights I'd dream about the old apartment. It smelled like cinnamon and cheap lavender detergent. The walls were chipped, the fridge wobbled, the floor creaked, but it was ours. She was mine. Now, she belonged to someone else. I was just a shadow drifting through a house that pretended to be a home. And she let it happen. That was the part that hurt the most. I didn't expect a party. I didn't even expect a cake. But I thought maybe, just maybe, someone would say happy birthday. A text. A card. Something. I walked into the house that morning still clutching the bus transfer I'd used to get back from school, my fingers freezing even inside my sleeves. There was a strange kind of quiet inside, the kind that makes you instinctively hold your breath. No balloons, no decorations, not even the smell of takeout. Just silence, thick and flat. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a second, listening for any sign that someone had remembered. Nothing. I left my shoes by the mat like always and walked into the kitchen, hoping there'd at least be dinner waiting. The fridge was nearly empty, half a bottle of ranch, some milk that had expired last week, and a single plastic container of leftover spaghetti with Jeff's name scribbled on it in Sharpie. That's when I noticed the pile of garbage bags by the door. 3 of them, tied up and sagging like bloated stomachs, each one jammed with stuff I recognized immediately. My backpack, my blanket, my shoes, everything I actually used or needed, packed up like they were clearing out a spare closet. Jeff walked in a few minutes later, holding a manila envelope. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how my day was. He didn't even glance at the pile. He just held out the envelope like he was handing me a parking ticket. "There's $400 in there," he said, voice flat like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. "You've got 2 months. We need your room for the new nursery." My stomach dropped. I tried to speak, but my mouth wouldn't work. All the air had left my lungs in one sharp punch, and I just stood there staring at him like I was watching a stranger. I managed to get out a single word, "What?" But it sounded wrong, weak, almost childish. Jeff didn't explain. He never did. He just pointed at the bags and said, "They're yours. Don't leave a mess." Behind him, my mom stood in the hallway, half in shadow, holding the baby monitor from Hannah's room like it was glued to her hand. She didn't say a word, didn't move. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes hovered somewhere over my head, like I wasn't a person standing in her house, but something she was trying to ignore on the floor, like a stain. I didn't cry. I thought I would. I thought I'd collapse or scream or beg, but I didn't do anything. I just picked up the envelope, felt the lump of bills inside, and walked out the front door without a single glance back. I didn't even try to slam it, just let it shut behind me with a soft thud. When I turned around to lock it behind me, muscle memory, I realized my key was gone. I tried it anyway. It didn't fit. Same shape, same color, same keychain, but it didn't click. Just scraped against the metal like it was trying to tell me I didn't belong anymore. I sat on the curb with my bags next to me for what felt like an hour. It was cold, that kind of late fall, early winter air that gets inside your sleeves and burns the tips of your fingers. I didn't know where to go. My phone was at 22%. I had $400, a prepaid flip phone, and 3 garbage bags of clothes, notebooks, and whatever else they thought I was allowed to keep. I thought about Julie. She was the one person who'd ever made me feel like I wasn't completely invisible at school. We weren't best friends, not really, but she was kind to me in ways that stuck. Let me copy her chemistry notes when I missed a week with the flu. Sat with me at lunch when I had nowhere else to go. I still remember the day she gave me her dad's old hoodie when I forgot mine. It smelled like car grease and peppermint gum. I texted her one sentence. "Are you home?" No explanation. No context. Just that. She called me a minute later. I didn't even say hello. I just said, "They kicked me out." There was a pause on the line, just static and breath, and then she said, "Where are you?" That was it. No questions. No judgment. Just where. Julie and her dad came and picked me up about an hour later. They didn't say much, but her dad had this look on his face, like someone trying not to punch a wall. When we got to their house, he carried my bags inside without a word, set them by the couch, and then said, "You can stay here for now. We'll figure it out." That was the first night I slept through the whole night in over a year. The next few weeks were a blur of school, borrowed clothes, and trying not to take up too much space. Julie's dad helped me look into my options, real ones, legal ones. He got in touch with someone he knew who understood how to navigate the court system. I didn't even know what emancipation meant at first. It sounded like something out of a history textbook, not a thing a 16-year-old could actually do. But it was real. It was hard, slow, frustrating, and humiliating, but it was real. I had to sit in rooms with people who asked me questions like, "Why did your parents remove you from the home? And do you have any source of income?" And try not to sound like a statistic, like a problem, like trash left on a curb. Eventually, it worked. I became legally independent. No more Jeff. No more Lori. Just me. I I still remember the day the judge signed the papers. It didn't feel like freedom, not exactly. It felt like being handed a brick when you'd been swimming underwater for years. Heavy but solid. Something you could build with. Something you could stand on. The truth is, I don't know if I ever stopped waiting for her to show up. To call. To say she'd made a mistake. To cry and beg and tell me she was sorry. But she didn't. And after a while, I stopped looking at the phone every time it buzzed. She was gone. I was gone. And somehow, I was still here. I don't really remember the first time I told myself I was going to make it. Not in some movie montage kind of way, with a pumping soundtrack and slow-motion visuals of me opening a textbook under a single light bulb. It was smaller than that, quieter. Just a decision I made while sitting at Julie's kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by empty coffee mugs and cold toast, trying to finish a biology packet with one eye twitching from exhaustion and the other skimming paragraphs I didn't understand. I was 17, legally emancipated, broke, and terrified. But I still had a pen in my hand and a goal, so that had to count for something. I picked up 2 jobs that year. Weekdays after school, I worked at a diner off Route 1, bussing tables and washing dishes until my back ached and the smell of fryer oil felt like part of my skin. On weekends, I worked at a secondhand bookstore downtown, mostly because the owner let me take home old textbooks for free and didn't care that I sometimes did my homework behind the register when it was slow. I made just enough money to cover bus fare, help out a little with groceries at Julie's place, and stash away a few crumpled 20s in a shoebox under the bed for what I kept calling after. I didn't even know what after meant yet. I just knew I needed to get there. My grades weren't just good that year. They were immaculate. I poured every ounce of frustration and fear and need for control into those assignments like they were lifelines. I became that kid teachers talk about in staff meetings. The one who never missed a deadline, who corrected typos on worksheets, who asked for extra credit even when she already had an A. I didn't care if it made me look desperate or obsessive. I was desperate. I had no safety net. No one was going to catch me if I slipped, so I didn't allow myself to slip. Not even once. What surprised me was how many people showed up for me in ways I never expected. My English teacher, Mr. Albrecht, started letting me use his classroom during lunch so I could finish essays without the noise of the cafeteria. My math teacher, Mrs. Kenner, stayed after school twice a week to help me prep for the SAT, even when she had 3 kids of her own waiting at home. I never asked them for that. They just did it. Not because they pitied me, but because they saw I wasn't wasting any of it. Julie's family became something I never thought I'd have again. Her dad treated me like one of his own without ever making it feel like charity. He showed me how to change a tire, how to read an electric bill, how to cook rice without burning the bottom. Julie became the closest thing I ever had to a sister. She didn't smother me or act like she was saving me. She just showed up. When my work uniform ripped, she patched it. When I broke down crying after getting waitlisted from a college I'd pinned all my hopes on, she sat next to me and handed me a cookie without saying a word. We didn't need to talk about it. She just got it. When I finally got the scholarship letter from the State University of New York, I stared at the envelope for so long that Julie had to physically take it from my hands and read it aloud. I'd gotten in. Full ride. Computer science program. I was going. It didn't feel real, not at first. Like the air had been knocked out of me, but in a good way. Like I was floating above my own life. Moving to college was less of a clean break and more of a slow exhale. I found a cheap room in a crumbling apartment 3 blocks from campus. It had cracked linoleum, a radiator that hissed like it hated me, and a toilet that needed a full minute to decide if it wanted to flush or not. My window looked out onto an alley full of dented trash cans and broken bike frames, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear my upstairs neighbor practicing clarinet at midnight. But it was mine. My key worked. My name was on the lease. I had no one waiting to shove me out the door. I survived mostly on dollar store ramen and instant oatmeal that year. I ate peanut butter by the spoonful when I couldn't afford bread and scoured the campus bulletin boards for every free pizza night or student union event with snacks. I timed my walks between classes around where I could pick up a free coffee or grab leftover bagels from a study session I wasn't invited to. I knew which vending machines had the best unit price per calorie. I kept a spreadsheet. I wasn't proud. I was just determined. Classes were hard, harder than anything I'd faced in high school. I was surrounded by students who had coding experience, whose parents were engineers, whose laptops didn't crash halfway through lab sessions. But I stayed late in the computer lab. I rewatched tutorials until my eyes blurred. I sent professors emails with lists of questions so long they probably groaned when they saw my name. But some of them answered. Some of them saw what I was doing and met me halfway. I didn't party. I didn't date. I didn't join clubs. I worked. I studied. I slept when I could. And every time I wanted to quit, I thought about that moment standing on the curb with 3 trash bags and a key that didn't fit anymore. I thought about the silence of that house. about Jeff's voice, about my mother's eyes fixed somewhere above my head. And then I opened my textbook and kept going. I wasn't looking to start a company. I was just trying to stay afloat, make myself useful, maybe earn a reference that didn't feel like a favor. It started during my final year at SUNY, when I landed an internship at a scrappy little education startup called Brightbridge. They didn't have air conditioning, the backend barely functioned, and I was technically supposed to just manage bug reports. But within a week, I was writing actual code and suggesting product features. No one had time to micromanage, so I got to work on whatever was broken, and most things were. That's where I met Nick Parker. He was one of the co-founders, about 5 years older than me, the kind of guy who always looked like he'd just pulled an all-nighter but could still pitch a room full of investors with his shirt half untucked and no slides. Nick was brilliant in the chaotic, impatient way that drove most people insane. He hated meetings, hated bureaucracy, hated people who talked about user engagement without having built a single line of product themselves. But when we talked about how students actually learn, about how tech could meet them where they were instead of treating everyone like a one-size-fits-all box to be filled, he listened. It wasn't some dramatic coffee shop moment. It was more like a long Slack thread that turned into a phone call, then a whiteboard session at 1 a.m. that bled into the next morning. We didn't even have a name for the idea yet, just a sketchy plan for a system that could actually adapt to how each student learned, not just what grade level they were supposed to be on. I knew the pain points because I'd lived them. I'd seen what underfunded schools and overwhelmed teachers were up against. I'd been the invisible kid in the back of the class trying to teach myself algebra from a library book. We wanted to fix that, or at least make a dent. We called it EdSync. The name came later, after a weekend of tossing ideas back and forth in a Google Doc that was mostly terrible puns and rejected acronyms. I put in everything I had, not metaphorically, literally everything. I emptied my savings account, just under $4,000, and put it straight into server costs and a minimal prototype. I started working 16-hour days. I stopped going to social events. I slept on a friend's futon for a month because I couldn't afford my rent and development hours at the same time. Nick matched my energy. He pulled in a favor from a designer he knew from undergrad. We worked out of a co-working space that had free coffee and terrible Wi-Fi. I think I ate more peanut butter sandwiches in that first year than I had in my entire childhood. The first version of EdSync was ugly. Functional, but ugly. The kind of thing that made you apologize before demoing it. We pitched it to a few charter schools, local districts, anyone who would listen. Some laughed. A few ignored us. But one principal, a woman in her 50s who had seen too many tools overpromise and underdeliver, agreed to pilot it in her school for free. Her teachers were skeptical. Her IT director hated us. But by the third week, students who'd been failing were suddenly engaging. Not magically, not like a commercial, but they were asking questions, finishing assignments. One kid even told his teacher it was the first time math made sense. Then came the backlash. Some districts said it was too invasive, that collecting data on how kids interacted with learning materials was creepy, even though we anonymized and encrypted everything. One school union threatened to ban the tool altogether unless we made the tracking optional. Others just didn't like that it made it obvious which teachers weren't adjusting their methods. We got called everything from Silicon Valley nonsense to data vultures, even though we weren't even based in California and had yet to take a single cent of investor money. But then we got lucky. Or maybe it was timing. A private foundation focused on education equity reached out after reading about our pilot in a regional journal. They offered to fund us, not just with a check, but with real backing. We signed our first institutional investment 6 months later. Nick and I flew back from that meeting with nothing but carry-ons and a pitch deck full of version 2 features, and I still remember looking out the plane window, watching clouds pass, thinking I had no idea what the hell we were about to do. But we were doing it. The growth was brutal and fast. We went from 3 people in a shared workspace to 70 employees across 2 offices. I stopped coding around the same time we hired our first project manager, but I still reviewed commits when I couldn't sleep. We had a customer success team, a sales deck, benefits. I got business cards for the first time in my life and didn't know what to do with them. I kept one in my wallet like a totem, like proof that all those years of scraping by had actually meant something. I was 25, hadn't taken a vacation in 4 years, and most nights I'd wake up at 3 a.m. convinced I'd forgotten some critical task that didn't even exist. But EdSync was working. Real schools, real students, real improvement. Not everywhere. Not perfectly, but enough. Enough to know we weren't just building something that looked good in a demo. We were building something that mattered. It started with an email. A Gmail address I didn't recognize. The subject line just said hello, like it was nothing. Like nearly 2 decades of silence could be broken with a single, lowercase word. I stared at it for a full 10 minutes before I clicked. The body was short. Polite. Too polite. She said she'd seen a recent article about me in Forbes, called it impressive, and mentioned that she had always believed I would do something great. She wrote that she would love to reconnect if I was open to it, that she missed me, that she hoped I was doing well. Her name at the bottom was just Mom. I reread it maybe a dozen times, not because I didn't understand the words, but because I couldn't figure out what part of my brain was supposed to be responding to them. It had been 19 years since I last heard her voice. 19 years since she watched me pack my life into garbage bags and walk off her porch with $400 and a key that no longer fit the lock. I'd buried the idea of her years ago, the way you bury anything that starts to rot when you leave it out too long. But I responded. I don't even know why. Curiosity, maybe. Or anger. Or some twisted sense of obligation that refused to die no matter how much therapy I fed it. We arranged to meet at a cafe in the city. Neutral ground. Bright lighting. Public enough that I couldn't get ambushed by sentimentality or whatever version of the past she was now choosing to remember. She was already there when I arrived. Same pinched smile. Same nervous hands. Her hair was grayer, shorter, and she looked smaller than I remembered. Older in a way that didn't just come from time, but from carrying too many things she'd never dealt with. She stood to hug me, arms open like no time had passed, like we were meeting for coffee after a long week and not trying to stand on top of a collapsed bridge. I didn't hug her. We sat. She talked, asked how I was, said she had followed some of my story, whatever that meant. She dropped Nick's name like it was a celebrity cameo and mentioned EdSync like she had always believed in educational technology. I answered her questions, short and measured, watching her eyes the whole time for signs of something real. There weren't any. Then came the shift. She brought up the kids. Said Luke and Hannah were both grown now, that Jeff had passed away 5 years ago from some vague health complication. She mentioned her youngest, Cole, almost in passing, like he was a line item she didn't expect me to ask about. She paused after that, let her spoon clink softly against the side of her coffee, and said, "They're all incredibly smart. Gifted, really. But the education system just isn't what it used to be." She looked up, gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and added, "Which brings me to why I reached out." She pulled a folder from her purse and slid it across the table. Inside was a typed letter, printed tuition breakdowns, even a mock schedule. She said Cole had been accepted into a private learning academy, one of those boutique, high-touch programs with individualized plans and on-site therapists and more enrichment options than most state colleges. It cost $240,000 a year. For one kid. She wanted to send all three. And she thought, maybe, given my success, I might be willing to help. I didn't say anything right away. I just sat there, staring at the numbers, trying to remember if she had ever bought me a birthday cake after I turned 12. I asked her one question. Did Luke and Hannah even know who I was? She hesitated. That pause told me everything, but I let her speak anyway. No, she said gently. We didn't think it was necessary. They were so young when you left. It would have only confused them. When I left. That's how she said it. Not when she kicked me out. Not when Jeff shoved an envelope into my hands and changed the locks. When I left. Like I'd just wandered off on my own and forgotten to send a postcard. I closed the folder and handed it back. She didn't ask why. She didn't push. Maybe she thought she still had time to work on me. Or maybe she knew, deep down, that she'd burned that bridge years ago and just hoped the smoke would finally clear. We finished our drinks in silence. She paid. I walked out first. I didn't look back. I never do. I didn't answer her right away. I let the email sit there in my inbox for a full week before I even opened the reply window. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I knew exactly what it would mean to say it. If I replied, it wasn't just a conversation. It was leverage. It was history. It was blood. I waited until the nausea stopped before I typed anything. When I finally wrote back to my mother, I didn't offer a donation. I didn't offer a favor. I offered terms. I proposed setting up a trust fund specifically for education, nothing else. No vacations. No new cars. No home renovations disguised as remote learning upgrades. I would fund tuition and necessary academic expenses, and the money would never touch their hands directly. Payments would be made directly to institutions, with receipts, documentation, and scheduled disbursements. She could pick a financial administrator. I'd pick one of my own, and everything would be tracked. Second condition, quarterly personal meetings with each of the kids. Not as some distant benefactor or anonymous sponsor, but as their sister. Not a secret. Not a myth. Not an erased line on the family tree. Real conversations, one-on-one, in daylight. If I was going to help, I needed them to know who I was. The third condition was the one I knew would hit hardest. Full truth. No more edited versions, no soft explanations, no phrasing that made it sound like I simply moved away. I wanted them to hear what happened. What Jeff did. What my mother allowed. The age I was when I was kicked out. The amount of money they gave me. The number of years they let pass without one word. If they hated me after that, fine. But I wouldn't be written out anymore. It wasn't about guilt. It wasn't revenge. It was about making sure they knew what they were asking money from. I expected pushback. I didn't expect the message I got the next night. It wasn't from my mother. It was from her husband's old email address. I recognized it immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in nearly 20 years. It was short, sloppy, furious. "How dare you drag this family through the mud," it said. "After everything you did to Lori. After the chaos you caused. You left. You disappeared. You don't get to walk back in now like you're owed something. You are not their sister. You were a phase. A mistake. Let it die." No signature. Just a string of profanity at the bottom that he must have typed in some frenzied blur. It took everything in me not to respond, not to burn the whole thing to the ground with one email. But I didn't. I forwarded it to my lawyer, then blocked the address. I'd already wasted too many years letting that man live rent-free in my head. I wasn't going to give him another second. 3 days later, another message arrived. This one was from my mother. It was longer, confused, defensive in that careful, polished way she had when she knew she was wrong, but couldn't quite admit it out loud. She said she needed time to process, that she didn't know if telling the truth would be helpful, that she was worried it would destabilize the family dynamic. She said Cole was too young to understand, that Luke had a lot on his plate, and that Hannah, well, Hannah's very sensitive. She asked if there was any room for compromise. She even called me sweetheart in the closing paragraph, like slipping that word in would unlock something sentimental that had long since fossilized. I didn't respond. Then, 2 days later, I got the message. It came through Instagram, of all places. A private account. Profile picture of a blurry sunset and a dog. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam or some PR inquiry. But then I saw the name. Hannah. The message was one sentence. No punctuation. "Is it true or you our sister?" I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something else. Something I couldn't name. Maybe recognition. Maybe loss. Maybe the first flicker of a connection that had been smothered for too long. It didn't matter what came next. That sentence changed everything. The first meeting with Hannah was awkward in a way that had nothing to do with age or setting. We met at a neutral coffee shop, too brightly lit, too many strollers and soft jazz in the background. And she walked in with this look on her face like she was still waiting for someone to tell her it was all a prank. She barely touched her drink. I could tell she was scanning everything I said, watching my face the way people watch courtroom testimony in movies. At one point she asked, very quietly, why no one had ever told her about me. I didn't answer that. I just said, I didn't stop existing, and she looked down at her hands like the weight of that sentence hit harder than she expected. That first meeting didn't end in tears or hugs or dramatic revelations. She just said thank you and left, and then messaged me 2 hours later to say she had more questions. We met again the next week. Luke took longer. He showed up to our first meeting stiff, formal, almost combative. He asked the kind of questions someone asks when they've already heard a very different version of events and don't want to admit they're reconsidering. He didn't say much about his own life, just asked about mine like he was cataloging facts. I didn't push. I told the truth, my truth, without flinching. He didn't say a word for most of it, just sat there, jaw tight, nodding like he was trying to keep his balance on some emotional tightrope. But then something shifted. Maybe it was when I mentioned the motel, or the fact that I still remember the sound of a plastic key card slot jamming in my hand. Something cracked open. He emailed me 2 days later with an apology, not for what happened, but for not knowing. And then he asked if I wanted to meet again. We did. A few more times. Each one easier than the last. Cole was different. Cole was 7 when we first met and had no memory of Jeff's worst habits, no context for the decisions that shaped my life, no reason to be suspicious. He ran up to me the first time with this wild energy like he already knew me, already trusted me, already believed whatever version of me he'd imagined. He asked if I'd ever been on TV, if I could teach him to code, if I knew how to fix robots. He asked if I was rich, and when I told him not exactly, he whispered, "That's what rich people always say," and grinned like he'd caught me in some adult conspiracy. He drew me pictures of our sibling team, put my name on his school art projects, asked if we could start our own app one day. I wasn't prepared for that kind of pure, unfiltered belief. It undid me in ways I hadn't realized I was still broken. With them, Luke, Hannah, Cole, I started to build something. Not a family, not in the traditional sense, but something honest. Something based on the truth. I told them they didn't owe me love or loyalty. I told them I wasn't here to replace anything or erase anything. I was just me. I was here, and I would stay if they wanted me to. I made it clear from the start that this was about them, not about Lori or Jeff. I refused to let the same hands that pushed me out get to claim credit for my return. I dealt with them only when necessary. Emails, paperwork, logistics. No emotional labor. No reminiscing. No performances. Jeff tried once, sent some long, over-edited apology full of passive language and decades-late insight. I didn't respond. Lori asked to meet again, said she wanted to process everything together, and I told her I had nothing left to process. We spoke again only in coordination emails and tuition schedules. I didn't block them, but I left the door shut, and they understood what that meant. I didn't forgive them. That word means too much, and they gave too little. But I didn't let them stop me either. I didn't carry the weight of their shame anymore. I didn't bleed for their guilt. I gave the next generation what I never had. The full story, the unedited version, the chance to know where they came from and decide what to do with it. I helped when I could. I set boundaries that didn't bend. And I built the rest of my life outside the reach of those who once erased me. Because my real home wasn't a bloodline. It wasn't defined by last names or legal custody or biology. It was built by the people who held me up when no one else did. By Julie, who opened her door without asking why. By her father, who taught me how to write checks and fix sink leaks. By my teachers, who saw me before the world decided I didn't exist. By the friends who came later, who didn't ask me to shrink, who never questioned the hunger in my ambition. That was my family. That was my homeland.